Hey, life group leaders. I hope you're doing well. This week, we're going to look at Luke 7 1 through 17. I'm going to add the first 10 verses to this chapter's unit because I think we see the Lord's compassion over life and death coupled well rather than just skipping the first 10 verses of this chapter. So, as you feel comfortable, you can do more or less. I just think there's a lot to mine from the centurion and the widow brought together to see who Christ is and his compassion with both of them. And so, as we look at this, I want to start off with the question: how do we see the Lord's compassion throughout the Gospels? You could also say, how do we see his authority up to this point? As each week we've been building and developing this idea of Christ's authority over life, death, nature, sickness, disease, any of these elements, it's good for us to have a recap and a reminder of who Christ is, because as we continue through this material, it's easy for us to take for granted the gospel. And I mean that in the simplest and most blunt way possible. Because when we think about the gospel, when we think about who Jesus is, when we read it over and over again and the stories have similar overlap, it's easy for us to forget who we are studying and talking about. So I don't want you to miss it. And so as we look through this, I'm going to start off with trying to see how do we see how Christ's actions reveal he is Lord over creation, and then landing the plane with Jesus' compassion reveals his authority over life and death. And as we do that, the structure is 1 through 10, 11 through 17. You can review my notes if that'd be a benefit to you. But as we look at this, we're coming, at least if you look at Matthew and Luke's account, it seems like we're coming off of two different events where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. So from Matthew 5 through 7 and Luke 6, now in Luke 7, I think it's good for us to bring that up. I'm not going to get too much into that here, but if you want to look at my notes, I give a brief comment on it. But after Jesus has been teaching on the mountain and equipping his people to go, and he called out the 12, he returns to Capernaum. And we know this is where Simon and Andrew live, along with Simon's wife and his mother in law. And we know this is a fishing village. But as he returns, we see that Jesus comes back and encounters a Gentile whose faith far exceeds that of Israel, which is amazing. And so as you look at the text, don't miss that the parallel in Matthew 8, 5 through 13, if you want a comparison of the text, it's really helpful. But Jesus returns to Capernaum, and then it switches and it says a centurion. Now, a centurion was a Roman officer, kind of like a modern would be like a junior officer today, but he had over 100 soldiers in his unit, and he would care for them, lead them, and so forth. Well, we're noted that there's a centurion, and he has a servant who is deathly ill. In Matthew's account, we find out that he's paralyzed and lying in bed, unable to move. And in this account, what we see is that this centurion has compassion for this servant, which would be unheard of in a Roman culture. And the crazy thing is, not only does he have compassion, he reaches out to Jesus asking for help. Again, some really interesting things about this centurion. One, he's not asking for anything for himself. We see he's very humble, he's very loyal to his bondservant, and he cares for him and he wants good things for him. So he calls on Jesus and he actually sends his men to go find him. And actually, he sends two different units. First, he sends Jewish elders to Jesus, which I think he's trying to respect the culture. Because consider, what would it look like if a bunch of Roman soldiers showed up and told this Jewish rabbi, you have to come with us? That wouldn't look good. So I think he's trying to be respectful. But he sends for Jesus, he asks for help. In my notes, I talk a lot about slavery, Roman slavery, and how one would become a slave, and show it's not the same as being an employee working for an employer. Instead, it was a very different lifestyle. But as you know, the passage that we see the centurion, he values his servant greatly, which would have been very uncommon in their day and age. And yet, the word of Jesus is spreading throughout Capernaum that he asks for help. He says, can you please come and visit? He sends these elders. We don't know if they're slaves or someone that he's familiar with because of his position, but he sends for them asking for help. And so they go to Jesus and they plead earnestly with Jesus. And what they note is they actually talk about the character of the centurion. They say he's worthy for what he is worthy to have you do this for him. So the Jews viewed him with high regard, and then it says that this Roman official loves the people of Israel, and the word for nation here is actually the one used for Gentile. So he's talking about the ethnic people specifically of Israel. And then he says that he's even helped them in building their synagogue, whether he had a hand in it or he gave materials and contributed to the building of it. We don't know. But because of this, we kind of get the sense that he's a God-fearer. This man's hearing of Jesus doing all these miracles, he believes that Jesus can do this. That doesn't mean he has saving faith in Jesus, but he believes that if Jesus says it, it'll happen. He's a miracle worker. He can do these things, so please go get him. So Jesus agrees. What's interesting is Jesus doesn't know this man. He has no obligation, but he goes anyway. We see his compassion. He goes out as he's on the way. The centurion sends some of his friends to interact with Jesus. And he actually stops Jesus from even coming into this house because he says that even the centurion, he says, do not trouble yourself, for I am unworthy to have you come under my roof. Again, very different. Consider the context. A Roman who has rule over Israel is saying he is unworthy. That would be countercultural. So there's something unique about this man. He's very humble. He's very intentional to care for his servant. And he says, look, I don't expect you to come to me or me to come to you, but I know that all you have to do is say the word and he'll be healed. Like, that's interesting. He has so much faith that Jesus has to speak and it'll happen. And he says this because of his relationship as a soldier and those under his care. And because he understands that when he speaks, people do it. And when he speaks, he knows they will obey. He understands this about Jesus, which is interesting because Jesus' response, he says, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And that's a really hard statement because what he's saying is he hasn't met one person in Israel that is like the centurion that believes Jesus will say, if Jesus says it, it'll happen. Now, again, not the saving faith, but at least trust that Jesus is unique. There's something special about him. So it tells us here that Jesus says, okay. And then as the servants get back home, the servant's healed. In Matthew 8, we see a little bit more about this. There's a lot more compassion going on. But what is interesting about the centurion's faith is that Jesus exposes the lack of faith in Israel. He talks about the unexpected faith of the Gentile, the spiritual problem, and all these things. And then it says he moves on. In verse 11, it says he now travels to a place called Nain. And as he goes there, he's followed by his disciples and a great crowd. And then there's an echo of a passage in 1 Kings of Elijah. It says, as he drew near to the gate, behold, a man who had died was being carried out. Jesus is showing up in the middle of a funeral procession. As he's walking into town, he sees this scene. And he sees this woman. It notes that she is a widow. That's important for us contextually. I'll get to that in a second. But it says that the whole town was around her. And so imagine Jesus is coming into this town, seeing this poor man being led out of his house on a procession, being surrounded by a bunch of wailing mourners, because that was a common element, in that there was this woman. Now Luke notes that she's a widow, meaning now that her son's gone and her husband's gone, she is left unprovided for. She has no one to care for herself. And so now she's in dire straits. And then the beautiful thing happens. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Now, at first, that may seem kind of uncomfortable. Why would you tell someone don't cry? Think about it. That would be very unsettling. If you just lost the last person who was in your family, who was caring for you, and they were gone, that would seem unkind. But it says that in his compassion, he commands her not to weep. In fact, he's about to do something amazing. He goes up to the bier where they put the man, essentially a coffin or a plank that they're leading this man to his tomb, that Jesus comes out and he touches them, causing them to stop. Now, if you remember Leviticus law, you cannot touch anything or you would unclean, or else you would become unclean. And so Jesus, showing his compassion, goes beyond that, doesn't even worry about it. He tells him to stop, turns to the young man and tells him to get up. And this is beautiful. He commands him, and then he does it. He gets up and he starts talking. This echoes 1 Kings. And as you think about this, he's paralleling Elijah, and he's doing something amazing because the crowd witnesses it, and they're filled with fear and wonder, and they worship God. And they say, a prophet is here, and that God has done something amazing. And so what's interesting is you see this parallel. But the woman never asked for help. Now, previously, the centurion did, and he had faith. We see no faith in the woman. The woman asked for no help. Jesus just shows up, sees a need, and he fills it. And so for us, as we're reading this, we see that Jesus has compassion on the living and the dead, and that he is consistently revealing the character of God's love to them. In fact, the Old Testament talks about this. The compassion that Christ is showing is the compassion that the Messiah would have in the last days. And so we're seeing that the last days is taking place as Jesus is now walking on this earth. And so when we look at this, you can look at the parallel in 1 Kings 17. But as we land the plane, don't miss that this passage teaches us that Jesus is Lord. He is fully human, fully man. He is compassionate, able to sympathize with his creation. He has power over life and death, and that he is wholly undefiled by sin. And so the beautiful thing is, in these two passages put together, we see that we need to go to Jesus with all of our needs, trusting his provision. Regardless of our station, we need to be humble, and we need to share the gospel with all people because he interacts with both Jew and Gentile, and he brings them together. And so as we follow Christ, let us show Christ's compassion to those we meet. If you have any questions, please let me know. I hope your study goes well. I'll be here if you need anything. God bless.